Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, Chapter 9. The Dashwoods were now settled at Barton with tolerable comfort to themselves. The house and the garden, with all of the objects surrounding them, were now becoming familiar, and the ordinary pursuits which had given Norland half of its charm were engaged in again a far greater enjoyment than Norland had been able to afford since the loss of their father. Sir John Middleton, who called on them every day for the first fortnight, and who had not in the habit of seeing much occupation at home, could not conceal his amazement in finding them always employed. Their visitors, except those from Barton Park, were not many, for spite of Sir John's urgent entreaties that they would mix more in the neighborhood, and repeated assurances of his carriage being always at their service, and independence of Mrs. Dashwood's spirit overcame the wish of society for her children. She was resolute in declining to visit any family beyond the distance of a walk. There were but few who could be so clost, and it was not of them to be attainable. About a mile and a half from the cottage, along the narrow winding valley of Allenham, which issued from that Barton, as formerly described, the girls had in one their earliest walks discovered an ancient, respectable-looking mansion which, by reminding of them a little of Norland, interested their imagination and made them wish to be better acquainted with it. But they learned on inquiry that its possessors of an elderly lady of a very good character was unfortunately too infirm to mix with the world, so she never stirred from home. The whole county about them abound in beautiful walks. The high downs, which invited them for almost every window of the cottage to seek an exquisite enjoyment on the air of the summits. We're all happy. We're an happy alternative when the dirt of the valleys beneath shut up their interior beauties. And towards one of these hills did Marianne and Margaret one memorable morning direct their steps, attracted by particular sunshine and a showery sky. The unable long to bear a confinement which the settled rain of the 2 preceding days had occasioned. The weather was not tempting enough to draw the 2 others from the pencil and their book, and in spite of Marianne's declaration that day would be lastingly fair, and that every threatening cloud would be drawn from their hills, and the 2 girls still set off. They gaily ascended the downs, rejoicing in their own penetration at every glimpse of the blue sky, and then they caught their faces in the animating gales of the high southwesterly wind. They pitted their fears at which they had prevented their mother and Eleanor from sharing such delights and sensations. "Is there felicity in the world?" asked Marianne. "Superior to this, Margaret. We will walk here at least 2 hours." Margaret agreed, and they pursued their way against the wind, resisting it with laughing delight in about 20 minutes longer, when suddenly the clouds united over their heads in driving rain set in full face. Chagrined and surprised, they were obliged, though unwillingly, to turn back, for no shelter was nearer to them than their own house. One consolation, however, remained for them, to which the exigence of the moment gave more than usual propriety. It was of the running with all the possible speed down the steps of the hill which led immediately to their garden gate. They set off. Marianne had the first advantage, but a false step brought her suddenly to the ground, and Margaret, unable to stop herself to assist her, was involuntarily hurried along and reached the bottom in safety. A gentleman carrying a gun with 2 pointers playing around him was passing up the hill with a few yards of Marianne, and when her accident happened, he put down his gun and ran to her assistance. She had raised herself from the ground, but her foot had been twisted in the fall, and she was scarcely able to stand. The gentleman offered his services, and perceived that her modesty declined what her situation rendered necessary. He took her up in his arms without further delay, and carried her down the hill. Then, passing through the garden, the gate of which had been left open by Margaret, he bore her directly into the house, whither Margaret was just arrived, and quitted not to his hold, but till he seated her chair in the parlor. Eleanor and her mother rose up with amazement at their entrance, while the eyes of both were fixed on him in an evident wonder of a secret admiration which equally sprung his appearance. He apologized for his intrusion by relating his cause in a manner so frank and so graceful that his person, which was uncommonly handsome, received additional charms from his voice and expression. He had been even old, ugly, and vulgar, and the gratitude of kindness of Mrs. Dashwood would have been secured by any act of attention to her child, but in the influence of young, beautiful elegance gave the interest to the action which came home from her feelings. She thanked him again and again and again, and the sweetness of the address which attended her invited him to be seated. But this is the decline, as she was dirty and wet. Mrs. Dashwood then begged to know whom she was obliged. His name, he replied, was Willoughby, and this present home at Allenham, from whence he had hoped she would allow him to honour the calling of tomorrow to inquire after Mrs. Dashwood. The honour was readily granted, and he was then departed, to make himself still more interesting in the midst of heavy rain. His manly beauty and more common gracefulness were instantly the theme of the general admiration of the laugh of which his gallantry raised against Marianne received particular spirit from his exterior attractions. Marianne herself had seen less of this person than the rest, and for the confusion from which crimsoned over her face on his lifting her up had robbed her of the power of regarding him after the entering of the house. But she had soon enough of him to join all of their admiration as the others, and with an energy which always adorned her praise, his person and his air were equally of that, the fancy of which her drawn and hero a favorite story. And his carrying her into the house with so little previous formality, there was a rapidity of thought which particularly recommended the action to her. Every circumstance belonging to him was interesting. His name was good. His residence was in their favorite village, and she soon found out that all of his manly dresses, a shooting jacket was the most becoming. He imagined, her imagination was busy, her reflection was pleasant, and the pain of the sprained ankle was disregarded. Sir John on them, as soon as the next interval of fair weather that morning allowed him to get out of the doors, and Marianne's accident being related to him, was eagerly asked whether he knew any gentleman of the name Willoughby at Allenham. Willoughby, cried Sir John. What, is he in the country? This is good news, however. I will ride over tomorrow and ask him for dinner on the Thursday. You know him then? Said Mrs. Dashwood. Know him, to be sure I do. Why, he is down here every year. And what sort of young man is he? As good a kind of a fellow I ever lived. I assure you, a very decent shot, and there is not a bolder rider in England. Is that all you can say for him? Cried Marianne indignantly. But what are his manners and more intimate acquaintances? What his pursuits, his talents, and genius? Sir John was rather puzzled. Upon my soul, he said, I do not know much about him as to all of that, but he is pleasant, good-humored fellow, and has got the nicest little black bitch of a pointer I've ever saw. Was she out with him today? But Marianne could no more satisfy him as to the color of Mr. Willoughby's pointer than that he could describe of her the shades of his mind. But who is he? Said Elinor. Where does he come from? Has he a house at Allenham? On this point, Sir John could give more certain intelligence, and he told them as Mr. Willoughby had no property of his own in the country, that he resided there only in the visiting of the old lady at Allenham Court, to whom he was related, and his possessions were to inherit, adding, Yes, he is very well worth catching, I can tell you, Miss Dashwood. He has a pretty little estate of his own in Somersetshire besides, and if I were you, I would not give him up to my youngest sister, in spite of all the tumbling down hills. Miss Marianne must not expect to have all of the men to herself. Brendan will be jealous if she does not take care. I do not believe, said Mrs. Dashwood, with good-humoured smile, that Mr. Willoughby will be incommendated by the attempts of either of my daughters towards what you call catching him, and it is not an employment to which they have been brought up. Men are very safe with us, let them be ever so rich. I am glad to find, however, from what you say, that he is this respectable young man, and those who acquaintance will not be ineligible. He is a good sort of fellow, I believe, as ever lived, repeated Sir John. I remember last Christmas as a little hop in the park. He danced from 8 till 4 without once sitting down. He did indeed, cried Marianne, with sparkling eyes. And with elegance, with spirit? Yes, as he was up again at 8 to ride to covert. This is what I like. This is what a young man ought to be. Whatever be his pursuits, his eagerness, and in them should know no moderation of leave to say him fatigue. Aye, I see it will be, said Sir John. I see how it will be. You will be setting up your cap on him now, and I never think poor of Brandon. That is an expression, Sir John, said Marianne warmly, which I particularly dislike. I abhor every commonplace phrase to which wit is intended as setting one's cap at a man or making a conquest are the most odious of them all. Their tendency is gross and illiberal, and if their construction could ever be deemed clever, time has long ago destroyed that, and it's all destroyed all its ingenuity. Sir John did not much understand this reproof, but he laughed unheartedly as he did that replied, Aye, you will make conquests enough, I dare say, one another. Poor Brandon, he is quite smitten already, and he is very well worth setting your cap at, I can tell you, in spite of all this tumbling about and spraining of ankles.